the main purpose of these sessions, of organizing this time in the winter AMA, is to encourage you to read the papers. And I think you'll find that what Ken has to say about this paper opens up a whole new set of potential directions for research. So we don't absolutely have to have Ken in the room to provoke you to read the paper. I'll give you a sample of a few things he said that might cause you to want to see the real thing. He starts by saying, by relying on extreme exceptions, this paper, rather than mainstream AI uses, the author's view of consumer experience overlooks more important everyday activities that are informative. It blames AI, I think this is the key idea, it blames AI for problems that are more reasonably attached to digital technology or to business or to society generally. In other words, don't put everything on the doorstep of AI. Now, Ken is, as has been said, a senior editor at The Economist. He's based in the UK. He has an assignment at the Oxford Said School of Business. He's a co-author with Victor Meyer-Schonberger of a book called Big Data, which I thoroughly recommend. It's a very good defense of big data. And what he's doing in his commentary is defending AI. And he's defending it against what he considers to be edge case critiques. So he quotes, for example, the statement, the authors argue the actual or perceived loss of personal control can turn into demotivation and helplessness. And he says the authors cloud the situation even further by taking the case of Layla, a sex worker who shielded her identity on Facebook, but regular clients popped up in the people you may know function. Edge case, very disturbing. As he says, an odd example considering the harm is unrelated to data collection. And yet one can easily imagine a situation where the user, Layla, would be happy to connect with the community of clients. That's his view. But what he's doing in the paper, in his critique then, is taking the issues that have been treated as the basis for Marcus and Simona's paper as sort of dividing issues. So they take very much a sort of on the one hand, on the other hand view. And Ken's perspective is, well, all the negatives are extreme cases. So he concludes, or he builds toward. Let's just take one of his questions. How can you run AI without violating privacy? He says data is crucial. We need a lot of it in order to make AI work, and the data demands of AI clash with classical privacy law, in which processes, i.e. a company, need to request the consent of data subjects, and the data must be both specified and limited in scope. And so what he's saying is you can't run AI unless you change those rules. As he puts it, how can we have a truly high-performing AI economy under that constraint? The answer is we can't. So a new arrangement needs to be established that wins consumer acceptance. So I think, there again, Ken, I see Ken's face. Ken, what I'm doing with almost zero time to go is just reading bits of the juicier parts of your commentary. Would you like to take shortly 10 minutes, 5 minutes to 10 minutes to summarize your position?
Yes, thank you very much. So first, I apologize after having spent the entire morning organizing the backdrop so that I would look very professional, professorial, lots of books and really good books. So I got rid of all the trashy novels and put T.S. Eliot right where it could actually be emblazoned and themed. I couldn't actually get online, so I apologize to everyone else, to all the other panelists, that I wasn't able to sort of listen in to the discussion of the previous paper, particularly important because, of course, I'm critical of it. And I think it's also totally disrespectful if you actually don't put in the effort to actually understand it, to then actually make the points that I felt made the point. So John, thank you very much. And I apologize to those listening and to the other panelists. So I'm glad to know that my son could give me his computer, but sadly his messy backdrop. Let me just take, as John invited me to do, maybe 5 or 10 minutes to discuss why I came to the conclusion that I did in my commentary to the paper. And I very deliberately wanted to focus on the paper rather than do what I think happens quite often otherwise in these sorts of settings, where the person who's invited to give a commentary uses it as the launching point for them to discuss their own shtick. And although I think there's sometimes a usefulness for that, I didn't think so in this instance, in part because when I was invited, and I was very flattered to be invited to offer some thoughts, that it was in reading the paper and disagreeing with it that I felt, hey, they did a good job in one area, and I think, fell short in another. So let me first focus on where I thought they did a good job. It is so easy for us when we look at something that exists, something that's around us, to actually see it in the way that we naturally see it. And we forget that there was a point, sort of like a ground zero, a first footstep out, where that terrain, that intellectual terrain, didn't exist, and you didn't have the landmarks left and right. And we take it for granted that those landmarks exist, and we shouldn't, because I think that it does take an act of imagination and concentration and intellectual discipline to create those landmarks. And I thought they did a very good job of creating these 4 features of how to understand customer experience and AI. And you can't sniff at that. I think that's special, and let's recognize that. Where I disagreed with it quite fundamentally was that the lens that they took the lens that the paper took was always on the negative. The glass was always half filled. And I thought that was a disappointment. I thought it wasn't true to the technology. I thought it was devoid of the technology and said more about their predisposition to thinking about how AI should work in the world rather than, or the shortcomings, the inherent shortcomings of AI, rather than something that really understood the technology itself. And to sort of focus my mind, I guess that one moment where I realized, yeah, I do have to write for the AMA on this, and for John and the other editors and for Christine, was when I realized that, and I'll cite it, they landed in an area that I thought was just perplexing, and I'll even cite it here. So if you were to go to about 2/3 into the paper on what is page 11 on the PDF of it, or page 141 in the actual text from the journal, you'll read at the very bottom of that page, in the medical domain, for example, the benefits of AI-powered surgical robots for consumers depend on the way in which the surgeon's input and supervision is designed. Surgical robots are more precise than humans. And then it ends later, the AI cannot yet outperform human doctors in some critical and technical social skills. People would be afraid to be operated on by an AI surgeon. And I'm scratching my head, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, I know all about AI, and I've sort of been following what's going on in AI surgery because it's sort of like the final frontier. It's just so appealing. You can just sort of imagine in your mind what this might look like. We have containers, we have parachutes, and you can sort of imagine that, like, a container from a container ship, but is a surgical robot, can land in the remotest part of Africa, right, for whoever needs this form of surgery. And people can just be wheeled in, sterilized, and the robot can do its thing, and a simple appendectomy doesn't need to be a death sentence, right? And you think this is just so beneficial. But the thing I know about it is that AI surgery doesn't exist. There's no such thing as AI robots that do surgery. There are there is a form of robotic surgery of which the installed base is a little bit over 6,000 units in the world. Okay, so it's very, very rare that you actually do AI, robotic surgery, but there's no AI in it, not a bit, because I also know what the FDA, which does medical devices, has approved, and they've only approved maybe about 30 different AI products, whether it's a diagnostic method, an algorithm for reading MRI scans, or something else. Or when it's a device, it's usually like a Fitbit that uses machine learning. So this just doesn't exist. So I went back to it and thought about this, and I said, AI-powered surgical robots for consumers. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, we've now strayed so far from the customer experience. What are we really talking about? And I felt like we're not really talking about what is in the here and now and conceptualizing it for what it's really going to mean for consumers. First, these robots, surgical robots, won't be for consumers. They'll be always industrial used, if you will, for professionals. And I think all you have to do is think about the benefits that you would get from AI surgery as opposed to any doctor surgery. And you think, this is brilliant. Who would really disagree? And I take umbrage with this element here that in the paper that people would kind of prefer the artisanal surgeon rather than a machine, in the same way that we might prefer a biplane to a jumbo jet. That doesn't sound to me correct. That's not my reading of how the world is going to unfold. But it said volumes about what I saw as a way that the paper misunderstood the way that AI is going to enter into the public sphere and to be so meaningful to consumers and business. So instead, and here's where I'll conclude, is I tried to put forward just a small scan of the horizon in which we can understand that the point about AI is not to replicate what people can already do, because people can already do it. And so although we can get a cost benefit from that and a performance benefit from that, the real interesting thing, and certainly a speed benefit, and a scale benefit, thereby a scale benefit, when you add it all up, you also get this benefit that you can exceed human capability because it can spot patterns or do things that no human would possibly be able to know or do on its own, or take too long to get there. And so once you realize that AI is going to open up a whole new area of economic activity and sort of a productivity, as a result, suddenly the mind opens up and the imagination opens up of how it can actually sort of go into the commercial sphere and what consumers' expectation will be. And although I think privacy will be important because it's going to be an important element of it, because all of these devices will collect data. That's actually how the AI works, by collecting data and then analyzing it. So too will these other features and I guess the critical one that we need to face, and marketers will have to scratch their head and figure out, well, how do they interact with customers on, is going to be if what is being done by the product cannot be explained in terms of how it arrived at its conclusions, how do we interact with customers to get them to accept it? And that customer acceptance, because of its benefits, not its shortcomings, that's where we disagree in the paper, I think it's going to be critical. And with that, I look forward to a spirited conversation, not only now, but also in the days, weeks, and months ahead, because I think it's a vital issue. And I'm really pleased that I can not only contribute to the special edition of the journal, but participate here today.
Thank you, Ken, and I hope that provokes people to read Ken's commentary. The positive thing from a research point of view is the conclusion of how can we get acceptance of technologies that can't be understood. But the question I'd love to get the academics to respond to is the contention that we shouldn't examine how AI replicates, but how it extends. Has your paper erred in being excessively focused on problems in replication of familiar experiences and insufficiently attentive to the ways in which it exceeds? Any response from the authors?
Maybe I can take this one. And of course, I'm hoping my co-authors will chime in as well. First of all, Ken, thank you so much for coming and for your very insightful commentary. It is important, I think, that we're having these conversations as we're all trying to push very hard against these frontiers that are being constituted by artificial intelligence. Now, to answer John's question and maybe also provide a bit of a comeback to Ken's points that are outlined in his critical commentary. In a lot of the different sections of Ken's argument against the paper, it kind of boils down to we shouldn't kind of worry too much because it kind of works okay for the majority of consumers. And part of me can understand this way of arguing, but the majority view might not necessarily be the most insightful lens for understanding the true implications of consumer AI on how consumers experience the AI. That's important to understand, that we're here looking at the consumer perceptions and individual consumer subject positions. Now, why am I saying this? There is something that we might want to call the political economy of artificial intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence doesn't just consist of capabilities, but these capabilities are constantly enmeshed in an ongoing conversation that is being joined by multiple participants. Now, as it currently stands, those participants are mostly male, they're mostly white, they're mostly of a particular socio-demographic background. And that's why I'm not convinced that an object such as AI doesn't need additional scrutiny or critical rethinking only because it works for the majority of people. I'm especially not convinced when such an argument is floated by a member of that majority, right? Ken, you and I, white male, looking at this topic, might actually have a very different perspective, lens, and experience with AI than many other members of society. So my starting point, our starting point for the paper is to develop empathy, to develop a perspective around how the experience with AI might differ based on a different subject position in the marketplace that might be considerably different from my own. And if there's one thing that I've learned as a researcher in general, having been in that business for 17 years, empathy isn't easy. And it's, however, desperately needed in the context of a new technology that promises a lot of benefits, but that, as we and many others out there say, has its benefits sort of differentially distributed to create an uneven landscape. So with that said, empathy then leads to the desire to make the playing field a little more even so that the majority becomes even greater. That's why I think John's point around extending our point of view around AI rather than just like replicating existing tropes and dichotomies around technology more broadly is what we're doing here. So for us, it begins with empathy and understanding that the experience other consumers might have might differ considerably from our own.
Rebecca, would you like to jump in? We've only got 2 minutes to go, but you've traveled a long way to be here, so we'd love to hear what your perspective.
I just wanted to add that one of the reasons that we focused on what seems like the replacement perspective, Ken, is that we know from research and how consumers respond to new technology, they often do it with analogical transfer, thinking, okay, what is the analogy of this thing that's being replaced? What can I use to understand it? And so for many consumers, that analogy often is an analogy of AI as a replacement. And since we're dealing with consumer perceptions, which are not necessarily always matched to reality, that sense of the potential that consumers feel like they may be replaced really became central in our thinking, even though that may not be the reality of what the technology is doing. And I think that bringing that question to the fore of how can we increase acceptance of this technology, and maybe that does involve a shift in consumer perspective to not use that analogy for replacement. I think that's a very valuable perspective for future research, and I appreciate you bringing that forward.
Ken, I don't want to give you a chance to make peace here, because I think what's valuable about these interactions is leaving the tension in the air for the audience to resolve by reading both papers. So would you like to pile on without being conciliatory?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a place for empathy and there's a place for tailoring technologies around the particular needs of individuals and communities that are different than our own. But I think there's also a place where that doesn't apply. So you can take the evolution of the mobile phone. The mobile phone was basically created by, I want to say, Marty Cooper, is it Broadcom? I've now forgotten the name of the company that he was at, basically Motorola, eventually Motorola. And Marty Cooper is a white guy. But people would actually feel that the mobile phone was a technology that sort of was enrobed around the white man. I mean, I think most people would see it as just generally a very good general purpose technology that all communities could enjoy and that didn't happen to have inherent qualities that made it, again, just less empathetic to other communities because it happened to be a white guy that created it. I think we'd all agree with that. Now, I think we realize that once we have that core technology, you can realize that the plan in which you bought your phone and you paid for a monthly subscription worked in the West, but you couldn't do that in Africa, for example, so you had a whole different economic ecology around how to deploy that mobile phone technology in Africa than in the West. But the technology itself you need not have thought of it in empathetic ways. Engineers just try to get it to work. And so I guess I would close by saying I obviously feel that the parallel with AI is that I think you're making far too much of the virtue of empathy when really what we're talking about is logistical regressions to improve algorithms that do certain things that lead to products and services that people like. Or to paraphrase Theodore Levitt rather, people don't want a quarter-inch drill, they want a quarter-inch hole. And they don't care if that hole is empathetic, and they're not going to buy the quarter-inch drill bit because of empathy.
Great. Must be fair to the next presentation. So I want to thank the presenters. It's been a lively and provocative conversation, and I hope it will get some readership of the articles, which are very important and raise very, very important issues and leave so much more to be done, to be said.